All right, welcome everybody to the final breakout session of the day. If you're in the back and you really want to be involved in the conversation, maybe move forward. We're going to try to keep this high energy for this last session, which I think is the most challenging, but also the most exciting to focus on. Unlocking the potential of EVs as grid assets. As people trickle in, I'll first do safety for those of you who haven't been in this room yet. If you look on each side of the room, there are exits marked if you need to leave, or you can go out through the back of the room. If we do need to evacuate entirely, you'll go out of this room to the left, past the fountain, down the driveway to where the main road is that you came off of, and that will be our evacuation point. Okay, let's get started. My name is Sarah Swickard. I am the manager of the Vehicle Grid Integration team at PG&E. If you've seen Lydia Krefta up here, she is my boss. I sit under the Clean Energy Transportation team. Oh, good, yeah, she gave us a wave like the Queen of England. And then up here, we have I call them the leading experts in VGI in the company, if not in the state, if not in the nation. We have Rudy Hallbright. He is an expert product manager for VGI on my team. And then we have Chris Morris, who is a principal product manager on the grid team. And all of the hard questions will be going directly to them. So think of the hardest ones. All right, so let's get started. Oh, whoops, there's our beautiful faces again. If you've been in this room for the first two sessions, bear with me as I repeat some things. But to level set everyone, PG&E has some big ambitious goals when it comes to EVs. By 2030, we want 3 million EVs connected to our grid. And in the previous sessions, we talked a lot about the challenges to connect every residential and commercial customer to the grid affordably, timely, and seamlessly. And then, as if that wasn't ambitious enough, we set another goal for ourselves. We want to leverage 2 million of those EVs to be grid assets by 2030. We want to create the most robust vehicle grid integration portfolio in the world and enable customers to have choice, control, and transparency over their energy delivery. At PG&E, what do we mean by vehicle grid integration, VGI? For us, that means anything that's going to shift an EV load or create flexible load from an EV. That can include passive price signals through rates. That can include direct managed charging. That can include export to the home, to the building, to the microgrid, to the grid, to anything else that you can imagine. So that's the umbrella of VGI that we are talking about here. And deploying V2X technologies is going to be critical, obviously, to meeting that 2 million goal, but it's going to be critical to meeting that 3 million goal because it's going to help us interconnect EVs faster and to help us unlock their full potential. Why do we care? Those are our goals. Why do we have those goals? Well, I think Patty stole some of my talking points. You heard there's going to be a lot of load on the system over the next decade and beyond, most of that driven by EVs. And there is a need to rethink how we're going to incorporate this load. The grid was not originally designed to see such a large increase in load, and load that is dynamic, load that's volatile, load that doesn't show up in the same place or the same time very often. And so by using VGI to orchestrate EVs, we can identify additional capacity on the grid and create a more reliable system. So that's one benefit of VGI and why we're focused on it. Second, it can lower GHG emissions. If we can orchestrate and manage EV charging to soak up excess renewables in the middle of the day, and then have those EVs export power during peak time so that we don't have to rely on natural gas peaker plants, that's going to lower GHG emissions in our electric system, and then obviously more EVs helps decarbonize the transportation sector. Lastly, the benefit of resiliency. So using vehicles to power homes, to power buildings, to power microgrids increases the resiliency of our customers and communities, particularly if they're facing potential grid outages. And that's what's good for our customers is good for PG&E. So now we've talked about the what, the why. Let's talk about what PG&E is currently doing. I'm going to go over this really quickly, mostly so that we don't duplicate efforts, but instead we can hear from you of what are the gaps you see here and how can we build on what we're currently doing to reach those 2 million EVs. So PG&E is doing the passive managed charging through price signals. We are launching our day-ahead hourly real-time price rate in early next year. We're also deploying sub-metering at the beginning, or this year, at the end of this year, to allow customers access to a separate rate to better manage their EV charging. On the pilot front, we have a lot of exciting work with some key partners like Ford, GM, Zoom, BMW, others, to test these V2X technologies and then to figure out how to scale them. And we want more people to partner with. We're also, in April, we launched the nation's first large-scale V2X pilots, incentivizing customers to get bidirectional chargers in their homes to then participate in use cases like backup power and vehicle to grid. So we have vehicle to home, vehicle to building, vehicle to grid, vehicle to microgrid. We are starting to test all of those applications across those use cases. And then the last kind of group of efforts that we're doing is around managed charging and orchestration. So with WeaveGrid, we've launched our EV Pulse pilot, which manages customers in high fire threat districts to have their vehicles charge before a potential power outage, so increasing the resiliency. And we want to scale that, and we've started to look at what does distribution orchestration look like? Can we look at a single transformer and EVs associated with that and manage their load to lengthen the life of that asset or to avoid any additional upgrades, which is, again, similar to the previous sessions. Now onto the problem statements, which is then what we want to get your input on of what are we missing, what are the gaps. So some pretty obvious challenges when it comes to V2X technologies. They're limited, they're costly, and they're time consuming to install. So right now, there are 0 commercially available residential V2G AC or DC EVSE to date. That had a lot of acronyms in it. I think most people know what they are, but essentially there are no products that you can go as a residential customer to buy that can do that bidirectional charging for your vehicle in your home. It's costly. Right now, residential bidirectional EVSEs range from $4,000 to $8,000, in some cases even beyond that. When you compare that to a unidirectional level 2 charger that's sitting around $1,000, in some cases even as low as $500, you're looking at least 3 times the cost for residential customers. And then when you look at the installation cost, you double that for a customer. If we're trying to get to 2 million, that's a pretty high price tag in order for customers to have to swallow. So those are particular to the residential customers. It's similar in the commercial, but not as acute. And then on the bottom of this screen, the process to install and interconnect is complex and time consuming. While not specific to bidirectional chargers, this is what the other 2 sessions were on. We face these challenges with unidirectional chargers. Again, this is an added complexity for customers trying out this new technology. There's limited visibility into panel capacity, into grid capacity. When you get into permitting and installation, there's variable requirements and it's costly to install. And then when we talk about exporting to the grid, that's where interconnection comes in through Rule 21. And that process is complex and takes a lot of time. So these are the challenges to even get VGI-enabled EVs connected to the grid. And this is one of the ways that we need your help. In addition to even getting those vehicles connected to the grid, we want to scale to 2 million and beyond, and we're doing something that's really never been done before. So innovation is going to be critical to scaling. So again, foundationally, we need to focus on reducing the cost to install and the time to install for V2X technologies. But then once we install these EVs, we need to ensure that customers are plugged in at the right time for the right amount of time in order to be able to be orchestrated. It's no use if they have a bidirectional charger, but they're never plugged in for us to be able to tap them when we need it for the grid or for their home in case of a power outage. So we need help knowing where are our EV drivers. What do they need to be incentivized to plug in? What does this look like for EVs to be able to stay connected and make this a good customer experience? And then we also need to talk about scaling. So how do we scale orchestration from the limited number of customers on time of use rates now, managed charging, and our 2 V2H installations? How do we get that to 2 million? What business models are needed? What's the value of EVs to the grid, to the customer? We need help thinking through that. We have, as you heard Patty announce, our DERMS platform, so we have ideas of how we want to scale and orchestrate, but we want to hear from you. What are we missing? What aren't we thinking about? What novel solutions are out there to get us to that 2 million in a way that's better, more cost effective than we've even been thinking? And then lastly, part of the R&D strategy is let's think outside the box. So V2X is still new, and there's a lot of things that we need to figure out, but we also want to think about beyond that. What are new and novel ways that we can leverage EV batteries, like second life batteries or mobile energy distribution or whatever other crazy thing that might be out there? We want to hear from you of what are things that you're seeing that you're doing to help us unlock that full potential of EVs as we scale both EVs on the road and then EVs that are able to integrate with the grid. So that was a lot. You'll have time for questions. I'm now going to invite questions from the audience and from our online audience. It should be the same as what you've experienced in other breakout sessions. So let's first take some questions in the room. Let's start over here, Brian.
Hi, Zach Wugin with Vehicle Grid Integration Council. You asked maybe what's missing. One thing that we've heard from folks out there speaking to customers, trying to build a business model around bidirectional charging in particular is, or any sort of vehicle grid integration, is the need to share the value provided to the grid, in particular the value for the distribution system with customers. So how does PG&E envision accomplishing this and making sure that customers aren't sort of missing out on the value that they're providing with their load flexibility or their exports? Is it through rate design? Is it through program? You mentioned EV Pulse and I think distribution optimization was the other term up there. So yeah, open question on how you envision providing that chunk of value to customers.
I will also, I think, use a line from Lydia. I think it's all of the above. I think we have some ideas. Real-time pricing is a kind of clear first example through rates of how we're trying to value customers charging at certain times and then exporting power to the grid. We're obviously piloting V2X technologies and participation in VGI activities through incentives to try to find that right level, whether there might be a need for additional incentives based on events on top of real-time pricing from rates. But I think it's an open question to all of what do you all see and how do you all think we should value it? I'll also open it up to Chris and Rudy.
Yeah, and I think maybe just to build on what Sarah was saying, like the CPUC asked us what should be the VGI decision pilots, and PG&E focused almost expressly on V2G. So all of our pilots were V2G, and we were awarded almost $12 million. And the vast majority of that is incentives direct to the customer. So if you get a V2G enabled vehicle plus charger combo, I think you're getting $3,000 or so, something in that range, as an incentive cash to go get that installed. So like that's the immediate, like, get in on that. We'll start to learn more about TOU. And the arbitrage opportunity on EV2 is something like 40 cents a kilowatt hour. Start there, and we're going to look for more opportunities down the road. But there's nothing better than handing out free cash. So like we need to see traction on that first, and then we can build on that.
And we do have two dynamic rates to add to that. So one rate is the VGI dynamic rate, which will be available for the pilots starting in our second phase of the pilots, which is really giving us some time for enough people to get the equipment, be interconnected and ready to go. And then there'll be a rate where they're getting a nice incentive for exporting the energy. In addition to that, we also have a dynamic export rate for commercial customers that's separate from the pilots. That's actually a fully implemented rate that'll be available early next year as well. So that's for anyone who wants, for school buses, for example, that are in a commercial fleet, requires being separately metered, which our VGI pilot does not, because in the VGI pilot, we also have other use cases, for example, being able to provide backup for a power outage. So some of the value points for customers are not just the distribution, not just those financial values, but also being able to keep your lights on. You know, I know Elon kind of missed the opportunity to talk about this, but you know, you could have a power wall, or you could have the equivalent of maybe 5, 6, 7, or 8 power walls in your vehicle. You know, and you can do the math to figure out you want to put that much money towards your next vehicle, having a bigger battery. Obviously, it gets you a lot more. You know, so there's a lot of opportunities for people who want to take advantage of that.
Do we have another question in the room?
Yeah, my name's Brett with Exotigo. We do underground mapping, but this is just kind of my interest in the whole topic. When you talk about kind of how this is deployed, do you kind of have any strategy on kind of the density of where you're targeting? And what I'm talking about is a lot of times I'm actually talking with airports like SFO, for example, and there's a lot of cars being parked there. They actually are talking about having to manage their own mini grid or microgrid. But there's sometimes, especially like BART, there's some cash pitfalls in terms of like these big projects, but there could be some opportunities for EV infrastructure at these like very dense areas. Is there any strategy on kind of how you're targeting the incentives at residential versus kind of commercial / these kind of public like places where, hey, you could have people just parking and contributing the grid, but and they may just get a lower parking rate?
I mean, I think we'd love to build to that. Right now, there's so little equipment that's out there. It's not like we can pick and choose so much as to try to get the uptake to happen faster. We're talking about like right now, you know, Sarah had talked about how there are no, you know, nothing you can buy today. I mean, you can buy, you know, for the Ford solution, you can buy something that'll back up your home, but it can't export to the grid yet. That's not activated. So we don't have anything that can export yet to really take advantage of those opportunities. We're going to see that happening more quickly in the commercial sector. So for school buses, that's a great opportunity. You have buses that are going to sit there in, you know, for the summer, largely unused. You have buses that can do their runs in the morning, come back, charge with solar, and then they can do their run in the afternoon and still have plenty of battery left when they get back. So those are opportunities. I think ultimately, I agree. Like if you're going to park your car at the airport and leave it there, then why not make some money while you're at it? Then we get into some conversation about, well, how do we figure out, so we don't, if you're gonna have, right now, most of the focus is on knowing that your vehicle, you have an interconnection agreement at your home. We know the charger, we know the vehicle, they work together. Looking longer term, I think we're gonna see a much larger opportunity through AC V2G, where the cost, you know, I've heard it spoken about it, the cost differential for an AC bidirectional charger versus a unidirectional, it's about $100. So that pays for itself, you know, in a few weeks. There's nothing to worry about there in terms of cost. We have a lot of barriers, and how do we get AC V2G approved? There's no pathway to interconnect except for an exceptional process. There's a lot of issues around how do we know where you're parked, where you're connecting. You've got the inverters built into the vehicle, not your wall. So there's a lot of unknowns. We'd love to be able to ramp that up a lot more quickly. When we get to that point, then a lot of these things will become popular. And I think we reach a certain point, I don't know when we'll hit it, where there's no reason for your car not to support AC V2G. There's no reason to buy a charger it doesn't already support that. It would be like, why would you sell one like that? Nobody would buy it, you know, but that we're not there yet.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think we would love to see V2G in the public space, but we haven't seen that from the industry yet. It's been more of a focus on the private side. I think one day there will be, you know, public V2G at airports and the like, but I think getting off the ground with fleets and commercial and with residential, I just want to put one plug in, which is we are actually deploying 4 bidirectional chargers at the Redwood Coast Airport microgrid. So there is going to be an airport with V2G chargers and some Nissan Leafs, but I'm not sure if it's going to be private use or if it's going to be public. I can look into that.
Let's take 2 questions from the online audience, then we'll go back to the room. I see you.
From the online audience, the most popular voted question is, How do we incentivize EV owners who are worried about their battery degradation?
That's a great question. We get that one a lot. And I think actually just recently we heard from one of our utility counterparts, Con Ed, about a pilot they did kind of testing some of that battery degradation in V2G pilots. I think it's still early to be conclusive in the results, but I think if you think about the discharging or driving of your vehicle, you are discharging power in the same way that you would be if you were discharging to the grid through V2G. So still a lot to figure out, but one other thing to keep in mind, and I think this was mentioned in one of the earlier sessions, when we talk about V2G, I think we are not exactly sure what the world will look like in the future, but it's not likely that it'll be daily export to the grid from vehicles. It'll be key times during a day, during key days during the year, and that I think lessens concerns about battery degradation. But Chris, Rudy.
Yeah, I'll throw a kind of technical answer to that one. You know, your EV, when you're accelerating, you can use up to 250 kilowatts. When you're DC fast charging, 250 kilowatts. You know, that's a lot of strain on the battery, and it's designed to take that. When you're at home, you're going to be using at most 5 to 7 kilowatts. So the impact to actual battery from like a power standpoint is relatively low. And the depth of discharge, so you're not going to go below 20% when you're at home. You're going to keep a reserve for home backup. You're really in the sweet spot of the battery where these are like easy miles on the battery. So I think that was a concern that we heard from OEMs early on, was like, what is it going to do to the battery warranty? Are we going to be wearing out batteries? Like, I don't think we've heard that much recently. And so time will tell, but there's a lot of reasons to believe that probably won't be an issue.
Yeah, just to build on that, I'd say the answer to it, a user asking that, is it depends. It depends on which vehicle you have. It depends on the rate you're discharging it, how much you discharge it. If you are like a lot of us, myself unfortunately included, I'll sometimes charge to 100% because my car is not smart enough to stop at 80%. I won't call out the automaker. But after this, feel free to ask me. And so if I let it sit for 3 or 4 days, because I don't commute to work very often, you know, that's doing more damage to my battery than if I let 20% of that get pulled off the top for grid resources. So I'm actually harming my battery by not exporting. Right. So like you can actually save the battery by doing some export. Then you have a question of, okay, let's say your battery, your car is air cooled and you're discharging it while you're parked and you're not getting a whole lot of air moving through it. That has a different impact than if you're liquid cooled and you have a more active cooling system. So it depends on the vehicle. You know, this just came up recently in a conversation about school buses where there's a school, I won't mention names because we haven't verified the information yet, but it seems that they're changing their design to use air cooling because they've decided that in the climates they're selling to, it's not a problem. It's pretty cool in the Bay Area. Well, sometimes. And I mean, that's changing rapidly. But if you're parked and you're discharging, that's going to generate some heat. So, you know, if you're liquid cooled, you're in a better shape. So what's that going to do in the longer term? I think we're going to see companies that want to be able to participate are going to be thinking about these things. You're also going to see it reflected more and more in the warranties. But again, like Sarah started this conversation, for the smaller amounts that we're talking about, right now, we're not talking about significant impacts to the battery. And where we need to get is to be able to quantify it. So you know that, you know, let's say it's costing you, you know, 3 cents a kilowatt for you to use your battery this way, and you're making 30, maybe that's fine, right? I mean, you're not going to keep your car forever. Some of these batteries have already been lasting for over a decade, and you might actually upgrade your car before that decade's over. So why, you know, like why, and I'm closing this point, which is, think about the fact that, you know, one of the complaints about electric vehicles has been that you've got to carry all this battery with you wherever you go. And if you're only driving 30, 40 miles a day, and you've got 300 miles of range, what are you doing with all the rest of it? Once in a while, you really need it. You're going to the mountains, you go skiing, you're going to want that, right? That's my particular use case, why I want longer range. But it's not doing anything for you the rest of the time. With V2G, it can be, and it can be covering the cost of having gotten that larger battery that you're benefiting from the rest of the time.
So I think one last plug for CARB, the CEC, or the state would be we could also use a vehicle warranty expressed in miles as well as in megawatt hours. Like, I don't see any reason why you wouldn't have that and protect consumers that way.
Yeah, and this is the Innovation Summit. If you have ideas about battery degradation, how to prevent it, how to provide information, we're all ears. Another question from the online audience, and then we'll go back into the room.
Next question from the online audience. How would it be beneficial to PG&E if they knew the panel capacity of their customers?
That's a good question. I think it's broader than VGI. With the information about panel capacity, I think that can better help us serve our customers. Here we have goals around EVs, but ultimately we are trying to serve our customers. And if they are interested in EV adoption, they often turn to the utility for support in that service connection process, for even information on what they need to do when it comes to EVs. And so having more readily available information about panel capacity can help us improve that customer experience. I think from a data perspective, having information on panels can also inform some of the upstream grid needs that might be necessary. If we have a neighborhood of customers who, as the state moves towards electrification, we know are all going to need new panel upgrades, that can provide us information for how to better plan for that neighborhood for some of the local distribution needs. All right, back to the room. Yes, you've been waiting.
John Powers with Alexity. We make load flexibility software. Why is this so siloed? What's special about an electric vehicle versus all the other flexible loads behind the exact same meter? And in particular, I'm talking about commercial, not necessarily residential customers. They already have massive flexible HVAC resources. Many are installing fixed, stationary batteries. What is a vehicle other than more flexible load to PG&E?
I mean, I think this is the vehicle room. So there's a supply and load management room as well.
I was in the load management group, and that's why I came in here.
Oh, okay.
Because again, we're treating this like there's a use case that is inherently different from all other loads. And that might be true for residential. I don't see how it's true for commercial.
We have a
load room, and we work really closely with our colleagues in that supply and load room to make sure that as we're thinking about what do we need to decarbonize the supply in 2045 versus how can we manage the demand side elements of it, we're thinking about buildings, EVs, many other things I'm sure that I'm failing to think about right now. But like, we are working really closely with them on one, and then I think on the residential side in particular, and even in some of like the fleet applications, if you're looking at like big heavy duty charging, megawatt charging stations, there's just this significant impact. Like I think one of the stats we had earlier was that 70% of the load increase that we think we'll see in the next 20 years comes from electric vehicles. And so it is such a substantial amount of that load increase that I think there does need to be a focus on like how can we manage that increase and integrate it into the grid, but we are trying to do it in a holistic fashion with our supply and load team.
Thank you.
I just want to add that I think it's great that you went to both, because we do need to find ways to connect these dots. And the difference is that the vehicles can export power. The air conditioners aren't as good at that yet. But ultimately, it's like, how do I figure out, given my energy needs, given the temperature, given my solar that I'm producing on my roof, how do I make the right decisions at the right times, all those things? How do we get all these things talking to each other? And then tie back to the last question, it's not just about your panel capacity, it's about everything you have. Like, what are your circuits? What's on the circuit? When do you use those items? And we have to be thinking that way. Then taking a step further, it goes beyond that. So I really want to squeeze this in, so bear with me for 1 second, which is, how do we not only look at all of those issues on your panel, but look at how your panel relates to your neighbors as you are on the same potentially transformer? And how do we do something at the edge of the grid where we can actually do dynamic management and figure out what's happening on that transformer. So we know when do we have to slow you down over here because we're going to blow your transformer. So let's not do that. But how do we do that transparently and optimize all this? And we need to get so far ahead of where we are to figure this out. And we need you all to get there. So.
Oh, sorry, Brian, all the way over here. I did what I said I wouldn't do. Opposite ends of the room.
For sure.
So if SB 233 passes this legislative session, in which by model year 2030, all EVs sold in in California would be capable of bidirectional charging, what tariff modifications for Rule 2 or 15, 16, Rule 21, et cetera, would be needed, or at least planned for now, so that bidirectional vehicles without those latent capabilities can be integrated into existing charging infrastructure? I would hate for it to be the case where unidirectional chargers cannot be interconnected because there isn't a means of recognizing that latent bidirectional capability for AC chargers or DC chargers.
Yeah, I mean, I think as part of the VGI decision pilots we're doing now, part of that is to actually really learn, like, what is the scalable approach? We're testing, obviously, time of use, right? But also real-time rates right now is an opportunity that we're looking into. To be quite frank, like if SB 233 goes through, we really need to think about, like, at scale, how would we set up a fully managed grid like that, and concepts around like the DSO, and should we create a new rate which is a flat rate, but for 2 cents a kilowatt hour off, we get to control the vehicle 20 times a year. Like, those kind of concepts would need to emerge, but between where we're at today and there, like, we have some learning to do and some strategizing, but the intent of everyone in this room is not to let that opportunity go.
And I think from like, oh, please, yes, Napala, the true tariff expert.
That was a really good question, and I'll keep it short because you did a great job, Chris. But so we need two big things, right? One, we need better tools that help us look at both load, like two-way power flows, right? So new load on the system, but also the capabilities to export power. Whether that happens through an Rule 21 proceeding, and then there's an interplay with both Electric Rule 16 and Rule 15, right? Distribution line extension or a new service extension. Those are all future scenarios, but I think absolutely we have to be collectively, I'd say everybody in this room, everybody online, these folks here, we have to be collectively engaged with the regulatory process, right? So that ultimately, whether it's some sort of additional condition that is with Electric Rule 21, that's already close to 300 pages as a tariff. It's incredibly complex. I think we tagged that earlier. Or is it something that we spin off new, right? That's essentially our optimized pathway for vehicle to everything. Mm-hmm. And I don't have the question on that. I don't have the answer or the more future questions, but I think that's where we need to go.
And I think that's a great call out of like there are some policy aspects of Rule 21 that maybe aren't as applicable to this Innovation Summit and the Pitch Fest, but process improvements or ideas, as Napalo said, for ways that we create a new process to interconnect. I think we want to hear from you all, who maybe some of you have gone through the Rule 21 interconnection process for other DERs and have some thoughts about how it might be improved or could be better. We want to hear those. That, I think, we recognize is going to be a critical part to scaling VGI, is getting that interconnection process right for our customers. Yeah, one more. Oh, okay.
Real quick, Mark Mamuket with Enphase, and in the spirit of breaking down silos, one barrier to the future state where one EV replaces 5 or 6 power walls is this concept of NEM integrity, where you have to make sure that your battery is charged 100% from the rooftop solar in order to export to the grid and get credit for that export. So does PG&E have a perspective on whether this should be solved through a technical solution, like something that can account for where the EV charges, or the green content of that energy, or is this more of a policy and tariff change that kind of recognizes that, you know, when we're moving to real-time rates and things that value the energy, you know, at the real-time price, it doesn't really matter, you know, if it's green energy at a home that's discharging, or if it's a vehicle battery that's discharging, regardless of where it charged from.
Yeah. So
It's a tough question.
like this is a hard one. I thought a lot about this one and trying to remember here. So I think there is a hole there, right? Like, so would you deploy some kind of credit tracking system to see in real time how much clean energy is in your battery? But then what happens when you go to a public DC fast? And like, does that reset? Is there some kind of standard? Is there a clock? So from like a technical standpoint, like I think we don't have an answer to that yet. I think there's needs to be a conversation around that, and some of the Rule 21 groups are a good way to do that. From just a practical and pragmatic standpoint, I think what we've noticed is a lot of Tesla PW2, for instance, is interconnected as non-export. So battery will charge from solar. You'll offset your peak load, but you won't send power back across the PCC and export from it. In that case, you don't have a NEM integrity issue. And so we need to observe and see a little bit, like, are vehicles going to be exporting regularly for time of use or for other kind of use cases like that? Or are they going to really only be exporting during like an ELRP event where they can get $2 a kilowatt hour? And if they're only exporting during those times, like, do we really care about the NEM integrity during like an emergency scenario? So I think it needs to play out a little bit. Certainly if you're using, say, 20 or 30 kilowatt hours of your battery on a daily basis to export and not just cover your peak, that is where you actually will be seeing some miles on your battery. Because, you know, 30 kilowatt hours a day, let's say 4 miles a kilowatt, that's like 120 miles a day on your car. So at that point in time, like, will customers do that regularly? Like, let's wait and see. But there are possible technical solutions, none of which are necessarily easy, all of which would need to be worked through with probably with the commission. Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question, and I think we'll end with one in the room, right there in the middle, Brian.
So V2G has been talked about for decades. I think you guys know the first Roadster could do V2G in a sense if you want to do a review at home. The thing that we're trying to solve here is for peak. So sometimes we get so caught up in thinking about like how cool the tech is, we actually forget the answer we're trying to solve for. So have you guys actually modeled how much energy you think you'll actually need to pull from batteries to meet that future load problem? Because like we've modeled it and we found like you could get 90% of the way there with 70% of EVs with just demand response without even like exporting from vehicles, right? So like time shifting is just as valuable in some cases as V2G. And so my question for you is like, have you actually modeled how much energy you're talking about so that you could be like, how many vehicles do you need? And to caveat that even more, like the second part of that question is most vehicles today can't do V2G, right? Like Tesla made vehicles that can't do it without some external hardware, right? Like you could do it, but it's not part of the car. And so you're talking about like mandating that. Is that really needed if the goal is to bring energy on and reduce your peak demand?
So let's talk. I would love to see your modeling of what you've done to see. We have, of course, done some initial modeling. We're actually in the midst of a very large scale modeling effort to quantify that particular need. And where on the peak, when on the peak, or on the system that we would need this flexible load. But I think we have done it initially. We know that we need to improve it, and we would love to collaborate with you, with everyone about the kind of assumptions that you think are going to be true, so that we don't overbuild the system or overbuild the need for bidirectional EVs or EVSEs. We want to get it right for the lowest lowest societal cost is the goal, not just to have cool tech driving around.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And sorry, maybe to add to that. So yeah, we have modeled it as part of our kind of 10 and 15-year planning. The reality is we're looking like 70% load growth on the system. We're not going to be able to peak shave out of that, right? So like across our system, and not the transmission system only, like down to the wire feeding your circuit, the secondary transformer, down to your conductor on your home, like there's limits all the way up the system, and we need to start managing to those. So that's not just going to be a peak shaving exercise. We could go and build conventional capacity, but we're also being asked to figure out, are there renewable and alternative ways that we can get to a more distributed future? And maybe there's actually a 2-for-1 or a 3-for-1 where you also get resiliency out of it. And I think just one last other comment on that. It's slipping me now, sorry. Oh, you have your comment, and then I'll come back.
Okay. So I want to say that, first of all, we're really early in this transition to electric vehicles. So the amount we have now is a small percentage when every car is electric, or just about every car. So I'm not as worried about the fact that most vehicles aren't today. Most vehicles will be in the future, especially in California. We kind of know that structures are being put in place. We're not just worried about the demands on the grid, as Chris was saying, from the vehicles themselves, but you look at electrifying your home, you're now heating and cooling your water and your airspace with electricity. You know, fortunately, you probably don't need to maximize your cooling just before you're going to hop in your car and go on a long drive every time, right? So you could give up a little bit of power from your car to power that. We haven't figured out all the possibilities. One thing we do know is that we've got the duck bill curve, which we're trying to deal with, where we have all this energy available during the middle of the day, up to around 2 o'clock or so. And how do we make that energy available much later when we hit peak demand without having to worry about peaker plants or running fossil fuel-based generation? So that's where these can come into that play to smoothen out that over time. So I think it's all of these issues. And
we got to wrap up.
Okay.
So
yeah, and
quickly,
I see
Chris.
the time's up. The only last comment I had, I'm remembering now, is demand response is incredibly expensive also. So we have to consider that. Yeah.
And with that, we'll end the final breakout session. Thank you all for coming, for participating, for your great questions. We will have the closing plenary in here, so you're actually welcome to stay. The other breakout sessions will be coming in. And thank you again.
You are invited to